Well, it's been a busy couple of weeks for world leaders. Many have been darting around the globe for a string of international conferences, including the G20, ASEAN and APEC meetings. It's Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's first summit season, and while he made it to a number of conferences, he sent two ministers to the UN Climate Summit, COP27, instead. COP is wrapping up today, and one of the big ticket items has been the discussion of what's called a loss and damage fund, debating whether rich nations should pay compensation to vulnerable climate-impacted states. While at the summit last week, the Minister for Climate Change, Chris Bowen, announced Australia would bid to co-host COP with Pacific Island nations in 2026. The pitch has received a somewhat lukewarm response over Australia's climate record. In this year's Climate Change Performance Index, conducted by NGO German Watch, Australia's been ranked 55 out of 63 nations for climate action. Well, for a closer look at what's gone on at COP27, we're joined from Sharm el-Sheikh by Climate and Energy Program Director at the Australia Institute, Richie Merzian. Hi there, Richie.
Hi, Cass.
We know there's a couple of hours before it's technically meant to wrap up. It could go on a little bit longer than that. But what have you made of COP27? Has it delivered any concrete actions? Has Australia announced anything new?
COP27 was always going to be a hard one. It follows on the coattails of the big Glasgow conference last year that agreed on a new level of ambition. And in this one was really about just bedding that down, making sure there wasn't any backsliding after a pretty harsh year in the energy crisis, war, increasing geopolitical tensions between the two major emitters. So really just bedding a lot of those wins down was a key part of this. And to some extent, that's been achieved. In terms of progressing things further, well, that's still to come. Yes, it's supposed to finish in a few hours, but it could drag out another night, maybe even two. The Egyptian COP presidency is struggling to bring a package together because ultimately this is about fairness. Have developed, wealthy, industrialized countries done enough to support developing countries on the front lines of climate change with enough finance, with enough support, enough compensation for the impacts they're facing? And on that one, the jury is still out.
I know that the COP president has been bemoaning the pace of negotiations. I mean, have they been slow or as fast as they possibly can be?
They've been slow. Things have been a bit disorganised here. But on the plus side, you have had a number of leaders that have come and they've reaffirmed their commitment to that long-term goal of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees. And also you've seen a good amount of scrutiny put on the major source of climate change, which is fossil fuels. Just last night, the UN Secretary General came back from the G20 and said that fossil fuel production is hijacking humanity, this expansion of fossil fuels. And you've seen a big push to actually name and shame that, which would be the first time in the UN history that you actually call for a full phase down of fossil fuels and stopping new fossil fuel expansion. It's unclear whether that will make the final text, but it's good to see that that's finally being called out because we're still going through the same process. There's over 600 fossil fuel lobbyists here in Sharm, as well as thousands of other negotiators. It's over the first time you're finally seeing that called out.
Yes, that language was critical, wasn't it, in Glasgow, whether you phase down or phase out or you know, similar to that. Richie, I want to ask you about loss and damage in just a second, but Kerry, I mean, what did you make of this? Is it a talk fest or more?
Well, there's actually two parts of it which we should also acknowledge. There is the talk fest, but I have to declare an interest because we've got a company over there representing an Australian technology which is all about taking banana plants and turning them into a useful product, because banana plants are actually a waste product, and they're getting really good response. So there's, you know, the green zone, and I don't know if our friend's been in the green zone. There's lots of people there, lots of really interesting people, lots of really interesting technologies being discussed. The talk fest is where all the politicians are. And that's the big picture stuff. And that's the stuff which I think it's always difficult because there is this ongoing tension between what we need to do and what we can do. And the problem is that there are a lot of people who are talking about what we need to do. There's probably not that many people who are prepared to move about what they can do. And that's where the issue is, particularly for the larger, better developed countries, because they're seeing as if they're being pushed into a position where they've got to pick up, they've got to pick up the can and pay for all of this. And some of them are reluctant to do that.
Yeah, and that's on that loss and damage,
Absolutely.
Richie, that I know that a lot of this discussion is centred around at COP27, where basically the wealthier nations are looking at compensation for the poorer nations who have had climate change impacts on them. Will there ever be a time where the wealthy nations won't oppose this? Because once that genie is out of the bottle, the cost could be immeasurable.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, ultimately, a lot of developed countries like Australia do provide this loss and damage finance practically when there is a major event, when there's a major storm or hurricane or something, extreme, then you do see these countries step up and provide aid or finance to recover and to help those countries on their pathway, because often it'll wipe out a good chunk of their GDP. Practically, it happens. The issue of putting it in a facility or a fund here is the potential liability that they're on the hook then going forward. And this bill is going to get more and more. You just think about what happened in Australia with Black Summer bushfires, with the floods. The damage bill keeps getting higher and higher. But on the flip side of that, it's like, well, will you, instead of compensating us, will you therefore do more in terms of emissions reductions? And that's the opportunity Australia has. If it wants to host a UN climate conference, wants to lead and do so alongside the Pacific, then it can also look at what it can do to step up. It could take a position on fossil fuels. It could look at how the COP it will host in 4 years potentially could actually push the agendas both on mitigation and on finance.
And we'll talk about that potential hosting of the COP in a couple of years. Kishore, if developed nations, though, came to the table and sorted out some kind of compensation, how hard is that going to be for them to sell back to their voters back home?
Well, yeah, really, really hard. I mean, in Australia now, I think we've got to a point where there is, the political willpower to do a little bit more. But, just 12 months ago, Australia's position at COP26, we were, I don't want to quite say pariah, but we weren't necessarily smiled upon by a lot of comparable nations. And, now Chris Bowen is, he wants to have COP here in 2026. He wants to sort of say that Australia is back when it comes to climate. But you can't erase 10 years of Australia's lost decade on climate, and you can't change the fact that, doing anything on climate has been politically so fraught in Australia. It destroyed prime ministerships, it destroyed governments, it changed and disfigured our entire political landscape. So all that's happening in the background, right? Before Chris Bowen or any domestic politician, Joe Biden in the United States, wants to make any kind of commitment, they've got to grapple with that. And in countries like Australia and the United States, which do still have big fossil fuel industries that employ lots and lots of people, that's going to be politically difficult.
Yeah, it's interesting. The numbers on how many people they actually employ is sometimes up for debate. But Ali, I want to ask you a point that Kishore just made there. Are we back on an international stage? Is Australia's reputation on the way up?
Sorry, is that for me?
Yes.
Yeah. Look, I think absolutely. And look, I have to declare I'm a member of Labour Party, but it's a breath of fresh air to see that we have had a change in the government. And I believe, look, the majority of Australians recognise the risks we face with the climate and also understand that we're not just straight away putting a stop to fossil fuel and people are not going to lose their jobs en masse as some people would have them believe. We are going to transition to renewables, and renewables are also going to create employment opportunities and new industries. So it's not necessarily one or other. It's about moving towards renewable, sustainable energy production and being leaders in that and creating jobs and maintaining our energy leadership, and at the same time addressing a very real challenge of climate change. And I think the last elections has made it very clear where Australian population stands on it.
Do you think, though, Ali, that the government is taking it seriously? I mean, the Prime Minister wasn't there.
Oh, look, I think government is. I mean, let's face it, we're facing a lot of challenges with a lost decade of failed policy on multiple areas. So there's a lot of hard work to be done by everybody, from economy, from foreign relations. Look at what happened in Pacific, to climate change. So I think there's good leadership in the cabinet, and I think right people are doing the right thing at the right time. And we'll see the results in a few years.
Lizzie, we hear so much in recent years in dialogue about the approach to climate change and the moral imperative that is behind that. Do you think that's a good enough motivator for governments?
Well, look, I think there is clearly a moral imperative, and that should be good enough on one level. The coming climate catastrophe is going to cause immeasurable harm to many millions of people, and it's a case of the rich countries doing what they like and the poor suffering as they must. And I don't think that's morally acceptable. And I think generations of people are starting to come to terms with that. In terms of governments, though, I think there are ways to sell this idea that other nations ought to be compensated for our poor policy making over the last 10 years in relation to climate, including guaranteeing stability in our region. If you're concerned about warfare, if you're concerned about civil unrest in countries that are our neighbours, you would be investing in trying to mitigate damaging environmental events. You know, wars are fought over resources. This is even true, I think, international relations to be engaging in planning for and managing clear climate catastrophe that's coming in our region. So I think there are ways to sell it, but I think there is still a moral case that can be made and ought to be made and probably should be led with to appeal to a common sense of humanity as a reason for mitigating these terrible disasters that are coming. And I would like to see that discussion continue.
Kerry, do you think that there will be an agreement on this climate finance, and who might be the likely signatories to that?
I don't think you're going to get an agreement in the next 48 hours. I think they've been working on it for a little while. I'd be surprised if enough countries actually signed it for it to be, you know, headline, if you like. I just don't think that there's to be frank, the calibre of people still there over the next 48 hours to actually decide that they can sign it. But, you know, it also needs to be done in the context in which, you know, you've referred to basically the political climate. I mean, Chris Bowen's coming back to Australia where people are struggling with energy prices. He's coming back to a country, I mean, there was, you know, a horrendous story in the news the other day about one company whose electricity bill has gone from $100,000, I think, a month to $300,000 a month, and they're going to have to stop production. I mean, all those issues. And I know that we all have to do something about climate change. I'm not saying that we don't have to, but all those issues in a political sense will make it difficult, particularly since they're now talking about including not only coal in this discussion, but oil and gas. I think that makes it more
Well, there was
complicated.
pushback on that, though.
Oil and gas, and that's what I mean. But there are others who would like to include it, and I think that will make it, if you get to the stage where oil and gas, then it will be almost impossible, I think, for an Australian politician to sign up to it.
But those climate change impacts we're seeing here as well, not just
absolutely.
both. But are they being ranked, do you think?
I think what's happening at the moment is that, and it's always the case with politicians, it's the case of what is the immediate that we need to address as opposed to the long term, which will actually put us in a position of being stronger. And for most politicians, the problem is the immediate. It's the fact that they're going to an election in 2.5 years. And in 2.5 years, they'll have to account for what they've done. Now, I'm hoping, and I actually said this before the last election, so, you know, you've got to be really surprised. I'm hoping that the Labor Party have the courage to do it, because I actually thought that the Liberal Party didn't. And I do hope that the Labor Party are prepared to stand up and take some really tough decisions. But I also hope they've got very, very, very good people who can sell it to the community.
Ali, you about to jump in there?
Yeah, what I was saying is that we're having this discussion from the problem point of view rather than the solutions point of view, right? So let's yes, there are a lot of problems. There is problems with people, the fossil fuel industry employing people, energy prices and everything else. But I think there are solutions which can be applied and investment which can be done on renewables. And the both private and the public sector is working on it. Let's focus on it. Let's have a conversation about what we can do which can sustainably produce energy, reduce costs while doing so. We're moving towards electric cars. We're going to get there. It's just a matter of changing that conversation from this scary things about problems and everything which can go wrong if we try to solve a climate problem to
Richie,
what we can do to solve it.
Yeah, Richie, was that discussed? Was there an area for that sort of discussion at COP with respect to the technology and the opportunities that exist?
Definitely. I mean, that's front and center. I mean, to some extent, everyone sees the energy crisis as a fossil fuel crisis. I mean, we haven't transitioned our energy sectors. We remained reliant on fossil fuels. The prices shot up and now everyone's paying through the nose as a result of it. So we still got the expensive energy system and now we're still getting the emissions. And those who have transitioned are here saying, well, look, we're facing much cheaper energy prices. And in a country like Australia that is rich in resources, we haven't organized it in such a way that we insulated ourselves. Instead, we're facing the full force of those international prices because we didn't organize for a reserve of gas, or we didn't organize it so that we would benefit from our resources. And so the question, I guess, that everyone is asking here is how quickly can we transition? Because we know renewables are cheaper. We know you can make renewables and storage. We know that electric vehicles will save people money as opposed to being reliant on oil. Australia imports 91% of its liquid fuels. And we know people want that. In the Australian Institute's Climate of the Nation survey, it found that 4 in 5 people want to plan to phase out coal power. And so you're seeing there's an appetite to move, not just because of the moral imperative, which is key, but also the economic case. And I think Chris Bowen has actually been talking to that as much as the moral case here, and is finding a lot of interest as a result.
And just finally, Richie, before we wrap with you, I mean, what are Australia's chances of hosting the next one?
Australia's chances are quite good. So it's put its hand up for the one in 4 years' time, which is when Western countries have an opportunity to host. And so far, the only competition that's publicly been made is from Turkey. And I think Australia is busy shoring up its support, and it wants to do so in partnership with the Pacific, in the sense make this a Pacific COP. And so so it's quite a strong bid. At the same time, I think, as Kishore was talking about, Australia has a credibility deficit here in the UN space. After 10 years of being a pariah, Australia has a lot of work to make up for. So it's not just enough to say we will lead on renewables and we'll help the Pacific. I think it also has to go a step further and say, and we will also look to transition out of fossil fuels. I think that's the kind of leadership that Australia can display over the next couple of years as it potentially locks in and builds up to host this, and also to compete amongst Australian cities as to who will host. We had Matt Keane, the Treasurer, in Sharm last week pitching for Sydney. You had the Deputy Premier of South Australia pitching for Adelaide. Hopefully this is a competition upwards to see which Australian state can put it on an example for how you transition.
Kishore, do you think that's how it's working out? It's a race to the top now?
Oh, I mean, that would be a very optimistic way of looking at things. But, you know, those are positive signs. Australia bidding to host COP is us telling the world that we want to take it seriously. Whether we match that with action domestically, whether the sort of domestic internal politics that have made climate such a toxic, divisive issue has changed, whether the 2022 election was a real sign of a new era, we'll have to wait and see.
OK, well, Richie, we need to head off now, but thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Richie Merzian is the Climate and Energy Program Director at the Australia Institute.